to update you on what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz with the latest ship tracking data. It's been analyzed by BBC Verify, showing
60 Iranian boats don't go looking for a U.S. aircraft carrier by accident. Not in the Strait of Hormuz, not in the dark, and definitely not when that carrier is the USS Abraham Lincoln. Over 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered force built to dominate entire oceans without stopping. In open water, nothing gets close to a ship like that. But this wasn't open water, and those boats weren't slowing down. The morning Hormuz turned wrong. 5:17 in the morning, the first radar return did not look dangerous. It looked annoying. One small mark blinked on the screen, then another, then a few more, low and scattered in the dark water ahead of the USS Abraham Lincoln. At that hour, strange returns were not rare. The Strait of Hormuz is never truly quiet. Even before sunrise, the water can be crowded with tankers, fishing boats, patrol craft, cargo ships, and small local vessels moving between Iran, Oman, and the open sea beyond. So the first contact did not bring shouting. It brought a second look. The petty officer watching the screen leaned closer, checked the track, and waited for the system to clean up the picture. Sometimes the sea throws back messy signals. Sometimes two small boats appear as one. Sometimes a fishing boat moves just fast enough to look wrong for a moment, then settles back into normal traffic. In Hormuz, you do not jump at every shadow, but you also do not ignore one. The Abraham Lincoln was not alone. No American carrier moves through waters like this by itself. The ship was surrounded by escorts, spread out across the darkness, each one watching its own lane, each one helping guard the huge carrier at the center. The Lincoln itself was a floating city of steel, more than 1,000 feet long, with a flight deck covering about 4.5 acres. It was built to project power across oceans. But in Hormuz, even something that massive has to pass through a narrow door. The strait is one of the most important stretches of water on Earth. It links the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it is only about 33 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes are much tighter than that. In 2024, about 20 million barrels of oil and liquid fuels moved through it every day. That was roughly 1/5 of the world's daily use. A problem there does not stay local for long. Iran sits on the northern side of the strait. Oman sits to the south. Between them, some of the world's most valuable cargo has to pass through a space small enough for fast boats to make dangerous choices quickly. The radar picture kept changing. What looked like scattered traffic began to tighten. The contacts were not all moving the same way, but they were no longer behaving like random boats either. A few gained speed, then more followed. Their tracks began leaning toward the same general area, not sharply enough to trigger an instant conclusion, but clearly enough to pull more eyes toward the screen. The first radio call went out. No answer. Another call followed, clear and direct, asking the unknown vessels to identify themselves and state their intentions. Still, nothing came back. Not a broken message, not a weak signal, not a confused captain asking for a repeat, just silence. That silence mattered. In crowded waters, even a small boat that makes a mistake usually says something. A tanker responds. A fishing vessel may answer badly, or late, or through a poor radio, but there is usually some sign that a person on the other end understands a warship is calling. Here, the contacts kept moving, and the radios stayed cold. American ships had seen Iranian fast boats make dangerous moves before. Some had crossed close to U.S. vessels. Some had ignored warnings. Some had used speed and confusion to test how far they could push. That kind of behavior was not new in the Gulf. What was new was the number of contacts forming ahead of them now. The screen was no longer showing a few odd boats. It was filling. One contact became several. Several became dozens. The tracks were small, fast, and coming out of the dark in a pattern that no longer felt like bad luck. The Abraham Lincoln was moving through one of the most watched sea lanes in the world, and something ahead of it was starting to move with purpose. Inside the ship, the mood changed without anyone needing to raise their voice. More sailors looked up. More hands moved over controls. More information was pulled from other sensors. The question was no longer whether the radar was wrong. The question was what the contacts were about to become. Then the count rose again. 60. Not 6. Not 16. 60 small craft were now showing on the picture. Too many to dismiss, too fast to treat casually, and too quiet to trust. They were not broadcasting friendly intent. They were not slowing. They were not moving like harmless traffic trying to stay clear of a carrier strike group. They were drawing closer. At that moment, the first minute of doubt ended. The crew was no longer looking at clutter, weather, fishing traffic, or harmless morning confusion. The dots had taken shape. The shape had direction. And the direction was aimed at the most powerful ship in the water. 60 boats, one attack. From the Iranian side of the strait, small boats have always been the easier weapon to hide. They do not need a giant pier. They do not need a deep harbor. They can sit near islands, shoreline towns, fishing traffic, and commercial routes until the moment comes to move. In a place as tight as Hormuz, that gives them a dangerous kind of freedom. A small boat can appear late, close fast, and force a much larger ship to decide what is happening in seconds. That was the whole idea. This was not a normal naval fight, where one large ship meets another large ship far out at sea. Iran had spent years building a different kind of threat around the Gulf. Instead of trying to match the United States ship for ship, it leaned into speed, numbers, and geography. Do not fight the giant in open water. Drag the giant into a narrow space. Fill that space with small, moving threats. Make the crew soar danger from confusion while the distance disappears. Now that plan was unfolding in front of the Abraham Lincoln. The first group pushed forward from the center, holding a line that aimed toward the carrier's path. They were not close enough to strike yet, but they were close enough to make their purpose clear. Behind them, more boats moved in loose support, leaving enough space between hulls to keep from looking like one easy target. The water around them was still crowded with civilian movement, and that made every decision harder. A tanker was not a threat. A fishing boat was not a threat. But a fast craft using both as cover could become one quickly. Then the second group angled away. It peeled toward the outer ships in the formation, not straight at the carrier, but toward the vessels guarding it. That move changed the pressure. The carrier was still the prize, but the escorts were now part of the problem. If the escorts had to watch their approaches, their attention could be pulled outward. If their attention was pulled outward, the center could feel the squeeze. The third group stayed low and wide, using darkness, spray, and normal shipping lanes to hide its true line for as long as possible. It was the kind of move that made Hormuz so dangerous. In open ocean, distance gives warning. Here, the coast, traffic, and narrow water all work together. A boat does not need to cross hundreds of miles to become a threat. It only needs to cross the last few. The swarm was not trying to be elegant. It was trying to overload. A swarm works because it turns one problem into many problems at the same time. One fast boat is manageable. Several fast boats are serious. 60 fast boats coming from different angles can force even a calm crew to sort too much at once. Which boat is armed? Which one is only blocking? Which one is trying to draw attention? Which one is carrying the real danger? Which one is willing to get close enough that nobody gets a second chance? Some of the boats showed weapons clearly. Heavy machine guns sat on open mounts. Small rocket launchers were visible on a few hulls. Other craft looked cleaner from a distance, and that made them no safer. A boat that looks lightly armed can still carry explosives. A fast craft can lay mines. A small team can launch a drone, mark a target, or rush close enough to force a reaction. In Hormuz, danger does not need to be large to be serious. The lead craft kept gaining speed. Their bows lifted as they pushed over the dark water, throwing white spray behind them. This was not a crowd of angry boat crews acting on impulse. The groups were moving with a shared idea. One element pressed the center. One threatened the guards. One tried to stay hidden until the final approach. For a swarm to work, the boats cannot arrive one by one. They have to arrive together, or close enough together that the defense has too many choices and not enough time. The first boats force a response. The side groups split attention. The hidden boats look for a gap. If even a few get through, the whole balance of the morning changes. The radio stayed silent. No apology, no warning, no claim of routine patrol, no attempt to explain why so many armed boats were moving toward an American carrier group before sunrise. But the swarm had one problem. It was charging into a battlefield it could not fully see. The carrier group locks the trap. Inside the Abraham Lincoln, the loudest thing was not shouting. It was the quiet rush of people moving where they had been trained to move. In the Combat Information Center, the room tightened around the radar picture. Sailors watched the tracks, checked ranges, called out speed changes, and fed each detail into the ship's fighting brain. The lights were low, the screens were bright. Every mark on the display had to be understood fast, because the small boats were no longer just approaching, they were forcing the carrier group to make choices. The carrier sat at the center of the formation, huge, steady, and exposed in the way every carrier is exposed. Its size made it powerful, but it also made it the prize. Around it, the escorts held their own pieces of water. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers watched from a distance, built for the kind of fight where one threat can turn into many. Closer in, smaller armed craft and watch teams covered the lanes where fast boats could try to slip through. This was the part the attackers could not see from the waterline. They were not facing one ship. They were facing ships and aircraft tied together by sensors, radios, and command systems. A helicopter could spot movement that a ship's radar might lose in clutter. One screen could help another screen. The Arleigh Burke destroyers brought Aegis into the picture. Aegis is not just a radar, and it is not just a weapon system. It is a shipboard combat system built to detect, track, sort, and respond fast. In simple terms, it helps a crew take a messy sky or sea and turn it into a clear fighting picture. That mattered now, because the danger ahead was not one large target. It was many small ones, moving in broken water, near civilian traffic, before sunrise. The shared picture kept growing. The carrier's sensors saw the main rush. The escorts saw the angles forming outside it. The helicopters prepared to give the one view no ship could fully have from sea level, the view from above. On the flight deck, the MH-60R Seahawks were already coming alive. Rotors turned into a blur. Crews strapped in. Doors were checked. Sensors came online. The Seahawk was built for work like this, hunting submarines, tracking surface targets, helping command the fight. The first helicopter lifted into the dark air, then another followed. As they climbed, the shape of the morning changed again. From the boats, the world was spray, speed, engine noise, and the narrow view ahead. From above, the swarm had no place to pretend. The helicopters could see the center push, the outside pressure, the boats trying to hide near normal shipping, and the gaps opening between groups. That overhead view was priceless. A small boat can use a tanker as cover from the side. It can cut behind a fishing vessel and hope a warship hesitates. It can run low enough that waves and clutter make the picture messy. But from above, those tricks become easier to break apart. The Seahawks did not need to fire to change the fight. They only needed to see, track, and pass the truth back to the ships below. Still, nobody could treat the water like an empty battlefield. There were civilian vessels out there, tankers with crews who had nothing to do with the confrontation, small local boats that might only be trying to survive a bad morning, cargo ships moving through tight lanes with no room for wild turns. That made every second harder. The American crews had to separate the dangerous from the innocent without losing the larger pattern. The warnings kept going out. Bridge-to-bridge calls, clear orders to identify, clear orders to change course, messages meant to give any harmless vessel a way out before the moment turned deadly. But the boats pressing hardest did not answer. They kept coming. Inside the Combat Information Center, the response was built in layers. First came the picture. Every contact numbered, sorted, and watched. Then came the lanes. Which boats were closing on the carrier? Which ones were pulling toward the destroyers? Which ones were using the traffic? Which ones were fast enough to matter first? Then came the assignments. Helicopters took the groups that needed eyes overhead. Destroyers held the outer angles. Close escorts watched for the sudden runner, the one boat that might break from the pack and sprint for the carrier's side. The Lincoln held course. Then, one boat made the mistake that changed everything. It drove past the warnings, past the last safe line, and into the space where nobody could pretend this was only pressure anymore. The first shot did not come from the biggest ship in the formation. 94 seconds of fire. The first burst of fire came from the sky. A Super Hornet dropped low over the water, fast enough that the sound arrived from everywhere at once. It was not circling to scare anyone. It was already committed. The jet had been overhead as part of the carrier group's air cover, watching the same broken picture from above, waiting for the moment when one fast boat crossed from threat into attack. The lead Iranian boat was still driving hard toward the formation, throwing spray off both sides as its bow slapped across the dark water. It had ignored the calls. It had ignored the warnings. It had pushed ahead of the other boats as if speed alone could beat distance, training, and every weapon now turned toward it. The Super Hornet came in low and sharp. Its 20mm cannon opened in a short, violent burst. The rounds tore across the water and struck the lead boat before it reached the space where it could hurt the carrier. The hull jolted, the bow kicked sideways, and the boat lost its line. For a second, the whole front of the swarm seemed to pause around it, not because anyone had ordered them to stop, but because the timing had just been broken in front of their eyes. That was the first crack. A swarm only works when the attackers arrive together. The boats need to close the final distance at the same time, from enough angles to force confusion. If they reach the target one after another, the danger changes. They are no longer one wave, they become separate boats, each one tracked, sorted, and handled on its own. The first hit did not end the fight, it changed the shape of it. Two boats behind the leader cut hard away from the burst, one turning left so sharply that it crossed behind another hull, the other throwing up a long white wake as it tried to escape the line of fire. That sudden move forced the craft behind them to adjust. A gap opened in the center. The outside groups kept moving, but the clean rush had turned ugly. The Seahawks moved next. From above, the MH-60R crews could see the swarm falling out of rhythm. Another was trying to use spray and civilian traffic to hide its turn. A third was still pressing forward, hoping the first strike had pulled attention away from the center. The helicopters marked them, called their movement, and kept the ships below from losing the picture. One Seahawk dropped lower, holding off the side of the formation, close enough to watch the runner without blocking the ship's fire lanes. Its crew kept the boat in sight as it tried to cut away. The craft was fast, but it was no longer hidden inside the swarm. It was alone now, and alone was the worst place to be. Close escort fire opened from the water. A 25mm gun snapped toward the runner and fired in controlled bursts. The first shots kicked up water behind the boat. The gunner corrected. The next burst walked closer, then struck near the engine section. The boat lurched, slowed, and began to drift as smoke curled behind it. Another craft tried to slip out wider, using a larger vessel in the area to make the shot harder. The Seahawk stayed above it, keeping the track clean. The escort waited until the line opened, then fired again. The boat lost speed, turned sideways, and stopped moving with purpose. The attack was falling apart in pieces, but one boat still kept coming. It had slipped through the first burst, ignored the broken formation, and pushed straight through the confusion. Maybe its crew believed the carrier group was distracted. Maybe they believed one boat, moving fast enough, could still force its way into the final gap. It drove through the spray with its engines screaming, closing on the carrier. The ships did not chase it. They did not need to. The phalanx mount turned. The white dome and gun housing moved with cold speed, locking onto the incoming boat as it crossed into the last close-in zone. Phalanx was built for moments when there is no more room for delay. It carries its own radar. It tracks its own target. Its 20mm gun can fire thousands of rounds in a minute. The barrels spun. Then the gun fired. The burst lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds changed everything. Rounds hit the water, the hull, the engine area, and the line of travel all at once. The boat did not sink slowly. It broke apart under the impact and vanished as a threat before it could reach the carrier's side. After that, the sound of the fight seemed to fall away. The Super Hornet climbed out, already searching for any craft that still wanted to press in. The Seahawks held their positions and kept watching the scattered boats. The escorts stayed ready, guns trained, waiting for one more runner to make the same mistake. But the remaining boats hesitated. Some slowed. Some turned away from the center, as if the crews were trying to understand how a plan built on speed had been stopped before it could arrive. The swarm still had boats. It still had engines. It still had weapons. What it no longer had was timing. And without timing, the whole attack had lost its teeth. Then, almost as quickly as it started, the water went quiet. And then came the strangest part of the whole encounter, the lesson hidden in the wreckage. The carrier never turned. That was what the surviving boat crews would remember long after the noise faded. The Abraham Lincoln did not swing away from the fight. It did not slow like a wounded ship trying to protect itself. It kept moving with the same steady force it had carried before the first boat broke formation. Around it, the encounter began to settle into something colder than the action itself. A few Iranian boats sat dead in the water, engines silent, hulls damaged, crews climbing out into the dark sea. On the American side, the fight was becoming a record. Every track mattered, every course change mattered, every burst of speed, every turn behind civilian traffic, every moment when one boat broke away from the others was saved and studied. It showed which craft were fastest, which crews pressed hardest, which boats were meant to distract, and which ones tried to use the crowded sea as cover. This was the kind of information no briefing room could invent. A drawing on a screen can show how a swarm is supposed to move. A training drill can guess where the lead boats might turn. But a real attack reveals habits. It reveals timing. It shows how crews behave when the first boat is hit, when the formation breaks, and when the path ahead suddenly stops looking open. That was the hidden loss for Iran. The damaged boats were only part of it. The bigger loss was that the attack had given away pieces of its own playbook. The way the boats formed, the way they split, the way they used normal traffic, the way they stayed silent on the radio, the way some crews turned away while others kept pushing. All of it became useful. Then came the recovery. The disabled crews in the water were not left there. Orange markers and life vests stood out against the dark surface. Boats moved carefully through the debris field. Men were pulled from the sea, checked, guarded, and treated according to the rules sailors still follow even after violence. The shooting had stopped, and the sea had returned to its oldest demand: keep people alive if they can be saved. There was no celebration in that part of the morning. Medical checks, counts, reports, damage notes, weapons reset, escorts still ready in case one more boat decided to turn back. By sunrise, the smoke was gone, but the message was still moving across the Gulf. Hormuz stayed open. By 6:43 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz was still open. That was the part that mattered most. The boats had come in fast. The water had filled with smoke, spray, broken hulls, and shouting over radios. For a few violent minutes, one of the most important sea lanes on Earth had been sitting on the edge of something much larger. But the route did not close. The Abraham Lincoln kept moving. Still, life aboard the carrier did not fall apart. Breakfast was served. Flight deck crews went back to work. Sailors who had been standing tense in dark rooms stepped into the passageways and carried on with the next task. That calm was not carelessness. It was the point. The ship had been built for pressure, and the crew had been trained not to let one violent morning pull the whole mission off course. Below deck, the routine kept grinding forward. Meals moved through the galley. Reports moved up the chain. Maintenance crews checked gear that might be needed again before the day was over. Nothing about the ship felt shaken. That steady rhythm was its own kind of answer, and every normal task made the failed attack look smaller. Beyond the formation, the wider world kept depending on the same narrow water. Hormuz is not only a military problem, it is an oil gate. In 2025, nearly 20 million barrels of oil and oil products moved through the strait each day. About 80% of that flow went toward Asia. That means the same water under the carrier's hull mattered to factories, ports, power plants, fuel stations, airlines, and families far from the Gulf. There are other routes out of the region, but they cannot simply replace Hormuz. Pipelines through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates can move some crude away from the strait, but not enough to carry everything that normally passes through that water. Gas is even harder. Huge amounts of liquefied natural gas also move through Hormuz, and those shipments do not have an easy backup path. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.